Lauren, I wanted to circle back around to something that you said when we were talking about Sunday Christianity and the need to be like constantly fruitful.
Mm,
Um, I just want to dwell on this just for a moment, and I don't know what further comments you actually have to make, but I wanted to read three verses from Psalm 1, which should be relatively familiar to everyone. Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked or stand around with sinners or join in with mockers, but they delight in the law of the Lord, meditating on it day and night. There's night. They are like trees planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit each season. Their leaves never wither. They prosper in all they do. This idea of being seasonally fruitful as opposed to constantly fruitful.
I feel like when you put it that way, it sounds so much more sustainable and so much more restful to be seasonally fruitful. But I don't think that that's what we teach. Like it's a lot easier to say it than to do it. I feel like as far as even just within the church goes, it's very much like we need to be giving all the time, and we need to be, whether that's volunteering or, helping with kids ministry or whatever that looks like, there's just this kind of constant give, 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 give. And, I have so many friends who talk about believers that they know, and they're like, well, I don't think they're actually a believer because I just don't see the fruit. And that always scares me because I'm like, well, what if I'm just not in a season of giving fruit? Like, oh, goodness gracious. So, I think it's a lot easier to say that. And when you say it, it sounds right. It's just not what we do. And I think that's true just of our own, I think just of the West in general. We're kind of given this idea of like, you do more, and the more that you do, the more successful you'll be. And so, it's just kind of go, go, go. There's not really this, emphasis on rest and Sabbath. And, I remember being in college, and there was one season, it was my first semester of my junior year. And I felt like God was calling me to a season of rest, which meant that I worked one job and then I went to school, and that was it. And I remember I was the most emotionally healthy that I had been all through college. And I was also the most miserable because I kept coming into contact with my friends who were like, oh, it must be so nice to have a day off, or, oh, it must be so lovely. And I'm like, you could do this too. But like, I also, the achiever in me was just like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough. And so, but I mean, when I look at like the times that I had with people and the time that I had to invest and like the energy that I had to invest in people, I was so much healthier than semesters where I was working 3 jobs, even if I didn't have to, but just because I wanted to be busy and I wanted to go and do, because that's kind of what our culture tells us to do. I think there's a part of it that feels kind of dangerous in a sense, to be like, well, like seasonal fruiting. It's like, okay, well, could I use that as an excuse then for this just like season that I'm in? Is that, well, it's just a season I'm not giving any fruit. And it's like, really, that's not why, but yeah, but I think like, to me, that just sounds so much more sustainable and healthy, and like the way that we're actually meant to live. I've actually been recently thinking about this as I don't really even know why, but one of my cousins, so he and his wife are Mennonite, and he was just put into a lot for deaconship at their church. And, that's a really big deal. And I was just thinking about like, oh, I wonder who their pastor is. It's like, I think their pastor is actually just like a layman. Like, I think he was just pulled by lot. And, he doesn't necessarily have this special training. And also, it's not his regular job. Like, his job is actually building trusses or whatever. And then he's also in charge of preaching, which is, this huge thing and this huge task. But because the community comes together and sometimes other people preach or, they give him time, and it's just this communal thing. Like church has become this communal thing, and it's not just another business. It's like actually this gathering of believers. It's not actually as stressful as just like, well, I'm getting paid for this, so I have to do a really good job. It's like, this is what I feel like God is saying, and so this is what I'm going to say, and this is, the lot that God gave me, and so that's what I want to do. And I'm not saying we shouldn't pay our pastors by any means, but I think there's something to be said about that lifestyle, and I think it's become so distant from what we're actually doing. It's very much like church is this thing that you go to, and then you go eat with your family, and then you hang out with friends, and it's like, it's not actually restful. Or it sometimes it's not actually restful. Sometimes it is, but this idea of just taking time and taking a Sabbath from the hustle and bustle of church and of life in general, I think could be really, really healthy for us.
I will again, give my caveat that I have not read the book. Okay. However, I have read another book called Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer. And he ends that book by talking about seasons. And one of the things he dwells on is winter and the importance of winter. And it seems to me that there is some commonality between the idea of darkness and being okay with darkness, and also being okay with winter. So I'll read you just a little bit and then you can respond, okay? So he talks about times of dormancy and deep rest are essential to all living things. Winter clears the landscape, however brutally, giving us a chance to see ourselves and each other more clearly, to see the very ground of our being. Our inward winter takes many forms: failure, betrayal, depression, death. But every one of them, in my experience, yields to the same advice. The winters will drive you crazy until you learn to get out in them. Until we enter boldly into the fears we most want to avoid, those fears will dominate our lives. But when we walk directly into them, protected from frostbite by the warm garb of friendship or inner discipline or spiritual guidance, we can learn what they have to teach us. Does that seem to coincide with the book that we're speaking about?
There's definitely themes that coincide there. I think one of the biggest things, like as far as just a season of winter goes, is that I think it can be really easy to just overlook and, pretend like it's not happening. I just recently heard this really, really good sermon about how, a lot of times, like we can do things on our own without the Holy Spirit, but it just makes us a lot more tired, and it's without the Holy Spirit. So it's going to be a whole lot less effective. And I kind of think about that when it comes to winter. Like if we're trying to grow fruits and vegetables and produce or whatever in the winter, it's going to be a whole lot less effective because you're doing something in a place that, or in a space and time that it's not supposed to be done. And so I think with winter, or the idea of like sitting in that season, I think that's something that Barbara kind of talks about a lot with darkness, is this idea of sitting with it and being okay with sitting in the discomfort of it, which is kind of what I think about with winter too. It's not a very comfortable season. It's not like a, restful summer meadow next to a stream necessarily all the time. And so like it can feel like a really hard season. And she talks about that a little bit with grief. She talks about that with this idea of like, I think one of her most powerful like images or visuals that she gives is this idea of sitting with the monster under your bed. So not necessarily not being afraid of it, but talking to it and asking it, like, where are you from? What are you doing here? And getting to know the monster under your bed in a sense, so that you can get this sense of like, why are you here? And not so that you can chase it away, or so that you can be afraid of it more, but so that you can get to kind of learn about it, and not necessarily even to gain a sense of clarity and then suddenly know all about this monster under the bed, but to slowly get to know it and build this relationship with it. And she talks about doing that with like your grief and your fear as well. And just this idea of being willing to sit with it and kind of get to know it and sit with the discomfort of it. Not necessarily because it's going to like be the best thing ever the next day. Like it could take years and years of doing that, but because the alternative is pushing it down, and that ultimately is actually worse, for your well-being, whether that's emotional or spiritual well-being or physical well-being even. Because, the more that you push down and push down and push down, the harder it is to keep everything bottled up. And so this idea of just sitting with and becoming intimate in a sense with your grief or whatever hard emotion it is, or your anxiety or whatever, not even necessarily to get you forward, even though it will eventually get you forward, but just so that you can process through it and kind of allow it to just be as a healing tool. I think that's something that we're not very good at. I'm not very good at by any means. But it is something that's necessary. And I think that's part of the winter is, kind of preparing the ground for the spring and preparing the ground for planting, and for the next season of production, whether, whatever fruit that might be.
I think that idea of having the conversation with the monster under the bed is just wonderful and fascinating. And I'll attempt to make an analogy and then probably close it out. This might be the end. But anyway, so there's a writing coach, and he talks about, when you're writing fiction, that you need to have conversations with your characters, and you need to let them speak and not put words in their mouths, And so the fun conversations are with the protagonist, the good person. The hard conversations are with the antagonist, because we don't actually want to hear from them. We just want to kind of characterize them or, caricature them, and then not ever really understand the important things that they have to say in the story. And I think that maybe that's part of our fear, about facing our fears, is that they actually are going to talk back to us. But at the same time, it's like, otherwise, the only understanding we have of these things is our own understanding, or like whatever we've learned, and we're not allowing, as you said earlier, we're not allowing the Holy Spirit to really work in that situation, and give us discernment and give us guidance. We're just running scared. And so, yeah, I guess, that's kind of the challenge all the way around. Is one reason that Parker Palmer talks about the winter is because he said he has a friend who lives in Wisconsin, and he doesn't understand this person because the person loves the winter up in Wisconsin. And the guy says, the only way you can love winter up in Wisconsin is to go out in the winter and enjoy the winter. If you don't enjoy the winter, then you might as well move. So, and I will just say, from my perspective, as being someone slightly older than you, these seasons just keep coming up and coming up and coming up. It's nothing that we're all going to face one time and just, we're on top of it and, got it all figured out. Yeah, that's not going to happen. So thank you, Lauren. Yeah, no problem. I like to encourage people that way. Yeah. So, but thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight talking to you about this book.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me on again.
And I hope we have an excuse to have you on even one more episode, even 5 more episodes. All right. And to our wonderful listeners who are so faithful in spending time with us, we're grateful for your time. And we hope that you have benefited from this discussion. And we hope that you'll join us next time on Moments That Matter. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.